Hi guys, I'm Shawn, and with my colleague Hemi from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, we'll be looking at the exercise that you guys have just completed and discussing the events within them and how those events have either strengthened or undermined the Treaty of Waitangi. The Treaty of Waitangi is the founding document of Aotearoa New Zealand, but its place in society and the extent that it's been recognised and upheld has varied and evolved over time. Hemi and I will be discussing how this evolution has taken place. So Hemi, we got the learners to look at some of these events, and can we start with Potato Te Whetowhetho becoming the first Maori king? How did that either strengthen or undermine the treaty?
Kia ora, Shawn. Well, the first thing is that it was an attempt by tangata whenua to try and participate in the new systems that were introduced through the treaty relationship. So it was looking at setting up a parallel system of sovereignty and determine who the sovereign power is and how they were going to interact.
And that was an important question that was posed by the treaty, wasn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's perhaps one of the greatest points of tension is around the translation between the two texts. Our government has given equal weight to both texts because they have strength of signature. But these tensions still exist today in terms of what does that mean for Aotearoa New Zealand, and how is that to be read in a modern context?
So looking at something like the New Zealand Settlements Act, which was signed in 1863, how did that impact the treaty?
Well, in a lot of ways, the New Zealand Settlements Act was intended to punish rebels. And what that effectively done was it took land that was collectively owned by one particular group and vested it in another group. Oftentimes they were two groups that already had existing tensions between them. So it was about rewarding those who were faithful to the crown and punishing those who protested.
And so how did that undermine the treaty?
Well, you have a look at how that's played out in the modern context, is that tangata whenua really own their own properties. We see tangata whenua still languishing at the bottom of the list of home ownership.
Yeah.
And of course, the biggest impact is homelessness.
Another event was the occupation of Pirihi by force, and that was in 1881. And the learners identified this as something that undermined the treaty, but why?
We need to understand what was going on at the time around Pirihi. And this was the first time that we see peaceful protest being incorporated by Māori who were marginalised and alienated from their land. So there were some strategies that were incorporated that actually were picked up later on by Mahatma Gandhi. And so
peaceful resistance movement.
Peaceful resistance movement. How did this undermine the rights and responsibilities of the Treaty of Waitangi? It was a lot about just taking what they wanted and then sorting out the process afterwards. Pirihi in itself was a small settlement, a young settlement, and it was a collective of people from different iwi who wanted to live tino rangatiratanga by self-determination. In a lot of ways, the 1881 invasion of Pirihi undermined all that and took away their right to actually live as Māori.
And that's a very important point there, is the treaty guaranteed self-determination.
Absolutely.
And so that goes in direct conflict to what happened at the time.
Absolutely.
So in 1907, the Tohunga Suppression Act was signed, and this impacted Maori spiritual healers directly, but there was a wider implication to it, wasn't there, Hemi?
Absolutely. It wasn't just about the spiritual healers, it was about the leadership, Māori leadership, marginalised from advising, supporting and guiding their communities. In a lot of ways it impacted on the practices, health practices of tangata whenua. We see that as undermining and continuing to erode the rights and responsibilities that were agreed in the Treaty of Waitangi.
Particularly under Article 4.
Particularly under Article 4, the Commission is one of the few organisations that recognise the what we call the Article 4, right to religious freedom, which was a verbal agreement that was held at the end of the signing of the treaty.
Yeah. And seen in a continuum, some of these events start to paint a picture, don't they, Hemi?
Absolutely. Continuing to undermine tangata whenua ability to live as tangata whenua, undermining, eroding the rights that were embedded in the treaty. This certainly was a peak moment in terms of negatively affecting the treaty relationship.
And changing that relationship from one of partnership to one of the governed and the governors.
Yes.
So part of what we had in the exercise is looking how Māori responded to some of these events. Mm-hmm. And one example is the founding of the Ratana Church in 1918, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So how did this strengthen or undermine the treaty?
We see this as strengthening the treaty because it's about Māori self-determination, particularly around spiritual and religious belief.
So there's a direct link to the example before.
Absolutely.
And you could almost see it as a response to it.
Absolutely. So, it happened near the signing of the Tōnga Suppression Act. So this is a direct response of tangata whenua to that act and trying to turn around the negative impact that had.
So Hemi, that wasn't the only way that Māori responded, was it?
Absolutely not. Throughout time, Māori leaders have continued to advocate and assert their rights with the monarch of England. It included travelling to England and other places to the United Nations as well, which was known at that time as the League of Nations. And so we see these different movements starting to emerge, political movements and religious movements that were all aimed at honouring the treaty and upholding the rights and responsibilities that were agreed.
And those actions and the pressure that they create give rise to a response by government as well. And one of those responses is the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi Act in 1975, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is where we see
it's a pendulum swing back.
Absolutely, it's a pendulum swing, a strong swing. We actually see the first time that the treaty has been incorporated into legislation. In fact, it's the first time that the principles of the treaty are articulated, and it's quite a depth of articulation. It outlines what that means in terms of rights and responsibilities, but more importantly, the obligation of the state.
Yeah. And what was the impact of this?
So, what's come out of the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975 was the formation of the Waitangi Tribunal. Unfortunately, they could only look at claims and issues that were contemporary. They didn't have the mandate to review issues that went back to 1840.
So it was a small but important step.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Interestingly, and we're kind of seeing a swing back with the next example, which was in 1977, the government announced a housing development at Ngāti Whatua Reserve land. Now, this was obviously very controversial at the time, and how did Māori respond to it?
So, in the 70s, we see a renaissance of Māori tangata whenua emerging in terms of claiming their tino rangatiratanga or self-determination, and several groups starting to emerge, such as Ngā Tamatoa. What we saw with the housing development on Bastion Point, Takaparawha, was that it was the last bit of land that the mana whenua had control over, and it was going to be sold off underneath them. So what that led to was the Bastion Point protest, which is the longest protest in New Zealand history.
Yeah. And that protest led to the government reversing, didn't it, the decision?
Absolutely, absolutely. It certainly reversed the decision, but that also initiated the mana whenua treaty grievance claim.
And at that time, that wasn't the only instance where land rights were met with protest, was it?
Absolutely. Māori were becoming more and more vocal about what they wanted, and that manifested itself in various ways. One of those ways was voting with their feet and protesting against these policies and legislation that was being put in place. We see a renaissance of Māori knowledge and ways of being and knowing starting to come to fruition.
Just talking about protest for a minute, the learners' next event that they looked at was the Foreshore and Seabed Act, which was in 2004, and this was another piece of controversial legislation, wasn't it?
Absolutely. When you look at the issues and unpack them, you see it's another attempt to marginalise tangata whenua from a treaty right, access to their traditional fishing grounds. And
that was guaranteed.
That was guaranteed under Article 2 of the treaty. And in a lot of ways, this piece of legislation contradicted that article in the treaty. There was a lot of protest. Tangata whenua from all over New Zealand, again voted with their feet and walked all the way down to Parliament to show their support for not having that legislation.
In 2010, the government finally endorsed the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and this was a long time coming. What was the impact of this endorsement on, the treaty, and whether or not it strengthened or undermined it?
Our Indigenous Rights Commissioner, Karen Johansson, suggests that the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is a modern interpretation of the rights and responsibilities and the relationship that was built within the treaty. It gives a lot more detail about how that's to be observed and how that's to be applied.
So it's quite a complementary.
It certainly is. It certainly is. It certainly supports the aspirations within the Treaty of Waitangi, and more tangata whenua are using the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People to underpin some of their work that they're doing, and particularly around submissions to government and the UN.
And this year in 2017, we had an event which we think strengthened the aims and aspirations of the Treaty of Waitangi. That's the Te Awa Tupua Waitangi River Claims Settlement Act. And so what was the impact of this act, and what did it lead to in practical terms?
Good comment, Shawn. I think what we see here is a couple of key features in this claim. One is that the claimant groups are becoming quite a bit more savvy in terms of how they prepare themselves and the information they use to support their claim. I understand that Te Awa Tupua leveraged off the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and there's a couple of key features within that claim that sort of give us an idea about how things have progressed The river, the Whanganui River, has been given a personality as a legal person.
And that's the first time that a river has been afforded that status, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's sort of built on some of the thinking and some of the some of what's been written about the Waikato River and other significant bodies of water. We also see the development of co-management and co-governance entities, particularly to manage the resource.
And this is something which you could see as the modern interpretation of exactly what people hoped would come out of the treaty.
Absolutely.
That promise of partnership.
Absolutely, shared partnership, shared responsibility, good communication between the partners.
And the value of recognising what each individual group can bring to something.
Yes. I think this recognises the intimate relationship that the tangata whenua living along the Whanganui River have, and that's captured within the settlement.
So Hemi, why else is the Whanganui River settlement important?
Well, it's one example of a negotiated settlement, and it has seen us develop innovative ways to promote the treaty intent.
So something that has been clear from this exercise, and that we hope that you guys have picked up, is that the treaty is a living document that has evolved over time, and our relationship to the treaty has evolved with it. How would you categorise the treaty and its place in New Zealand society today, Hemi?
I think the treaty is the founding document of our state. It's been described as the promise of two peoples to take the best possible care of each other.
Thank you for that. And we hope that you got something out of this exercise, and we'll continue to go through the course and learn more.